Okay, so tonight we're going to go into Jericho. The walls are going to fall down. The army is going to enter. And we're going to do our best to pull from what this account tells us some ways for us to live our life today. Now, that's not that easy if you think about it sometimes. But the principles that God used in dealing with Israel are the same principles that he uses today. And so through this, we can see some physical manifestations of how God wants us to respond to him and what he's willing to do for us. Joshua 1:6 is kind of let's say, an overarching, encouraging verse that is said to Joshua. And he's encouraged to be strong and courageous, and that is the same thing I think we today are encouraged to be, strong and courageous. We will see some ways that plays out tonight. We will see some in the next study, and we'll see some toward in the last study. So we got about 3 or 4 more to go. So they needed to have strength, they needed to have courage, but they needed help, right? Needed help. They needed to be ready, okay? And there were several things that we've already looked at, consecrating themselves and so on, that readied themselves and sort of, revved up, if you will, their spiritual side, okay? Because they were going to have to believe God and believe what he was telling them was going to happen, even without really, when it came right down to it, an armorer's view of getting ready, okay, to do battle with someone. Before we do that, let's talk just a little bit about how the spies ended their spying, if you will. We know that they left and they went back and they met with Joshua, the son of Nun, and told him what had happened, right, with Rahab and so on. And this is what they said then to Joshua: "Truly the Lord has given all the land into our hands, and also all the inhabitants of the land melt away because of us." So this is what they believed when they came back from having their conversation with Rahab. They really didn't tell us that they met with a lot of other people, did they? They had this interaction with her, and she told them what they were thinking. And so I think that in their idea, this last note here, their confidence, if you will, surely the Lord has given all the land into our hands. Have they done it yet? No, they haven't. This is sort of what that Ray had used in his lesson not long ago, right? Talking as if something's already happened, but it's going to happen in the future, okay? I think it's called perfect tense or perfect future or something like that, okay? Let's look at, for a few minutes, what God thinks, if you will, about our dependence and where it needs to come from, okay? We're going to look at a few chapters, few verses here. I think that it's interesting to me, if I were one of them, I'd be wondering, how are we going to do this, If I was a man of war and I was in the army, and I see us like washing ourselves, to get prepared to go fight, there's a dependence here that Joshua and God want the people to understand. And so let's look here for a minute at Jeremiah 15. And we're going to read these 5 verses, and so you can either follow on the screen or in your Bible. And this is probably, I believe it's the ESV version. It says, "Thus says the Lord, cursed is the man who trusts in man and makes flesh his strength, whose heart turns away from the Lord. He is like a shrub in the desert, and shall not see any good come. He shall dwell in the parched places of the wilderness, in an uninhabited salt land. So that's not too good for plants. Blessed is the man who trusts in the Lord, whose trust is the Lord. He is like a tree planted by the water that sends out its roots by the stream and does not fear when heat comes, for its leaves remain green and is not anxious in the year of drought, for it does not cease to bear fruit. The heart is deceitful above all things, desperately sick. Who can understand it? I, the Lord, search the heart and test the mind, to give every man according to his ways, according to the fruit of his deeds. Okay, this is the God that they're dealing with. Okay, this is the God that's going to take them into battle, the God that's going to be with them, that's preparing them for this. Even though in really no military way does this seem to make much sense yet, right? And so later, more information will come. It will never feel exactly like what we would think of a battle, a regular battle. Right? This is going to be God's battle. Just like us today, when we go to battle in a fleshly manner, we're going to lose. But if we go to battle in a spiritual way with Satan, we will win. Just to look at a couple of things, this is if you could just get the layout of where they're at. They're going to cross over the red line, so they're going to cross over Jordan. I didn't put a lot of local pictures in there. We have had many up here on the wall, but from where they were at, they would be looking in the middle of Canaan. And there would be the way to enter Canaan from the central middle is going to be through Jericho and Ai. Okay, and so that's, if you will, one of the plans or one of the overarching ways of attacking, you will, breaking up Canaan for them to go in and conquer it. This pattern or this divine strategy, if you will, for the conquest of Canaan, focused on a geographical anomaly first, right? Go in through the center, split the land, and then battle. We'll see later in the later chapters of Joshua just exactly how those battles work, because the kings from each area are going to be the ones they fight. And so he splits the land, if you will. Okay, and you can see here this area, this Gilgal, we talked about this already, was going to kind of be their temporary headquarters once they are getting ready, assembling themselves, ready to go into to battle. So they attacked the central position first, which then prepared the way for them for the operations in the north and south. And that's kind of how we'll talk about it: the north battles and the south battles. Okay, when we get into it. Okay, so the first 6 or 7 verses of Joshua, chapter 6. Well, we see this plan kind of play out, and we can look at this. It was a plan for conquering the land, and sometimes I forget that there were still some giants, okay, that were going to be fought. Okay, they were going to have to be fought. When Caleb gets his inheritance, he says, "Give me this mountain," which is where a stronghold where the giants are at. Okay, go Caleb. So, I think that it's interesting, how the land itself is going to play out as part of the way the military approach is going to be taken. But the last sentence really is the key. God never leaves his people to their own strategies, okay, if he's leading, right? If he's leading, then he's going to tell them how it's going to come. So he comes to their aid with his own divinely provided plan for them to be able to do this. We have a lot of those weapons, those kinds of spiritual weapons available to us today, don't we? And God tells us how to use them, whether it be get ourselves ready, consecrating ourselves, revving up our spirit, right? Getting ready to go out and do battle, if you will, with Satan in a kind of in a very, to me, in a very real way. Okay, we attack Satan. We have a battle with Satan in this world today. Similar, they were going to battle with Satan then. Okay? They were more physical, obviously. We are more spiritual, but we are still in a battle. In Proverbs, the 3rd chapter, in verse 5, I think we are encouraged, they were encouraged to trust in the Lord, right? Trust in the Lord with all your heart. Do not depend on your own understanding. Seek his will in all you do, and he will show you which path to take. I think this was a key to their success. Is that this is how God wanted them to get themselves ready to be able to do battle on his behalf. Because once this starts, okay, it's not going to stop until the land is split and divided. Okay, and so they have to follow God in every way that he leads them. Jeremiah 9 tells us, this is what the Lord says: don't let the wise boast in their wisdom. Another way to say that is, don't be led by your own wisdom, right? I mean, don't think your wisdom is something that is special. Or the powerful boast in their power, okay? We know today, a lot of people seek power. Our leaders sometimes seek their positions just for the power of having that position. Or the rich boast in their riches. And I think and I delight in these things. I, the Lord, has spoken. So I think the things that I get from this is that God doesn't care about those things. The very things that we want, power, wisdom, man's wisdom, etc., God does not delight in these things, right? And he delights instead of us truly knowing him, right? He instead delights in unfailing love. Okay? And he delights in bringing justice and righteousness to the earth. And those are the things that he says he delights in. Those are not normally how we as humans approach things, are they? One of the things that often we do is we want to know, we want the position, we want to be recognized, right? We want to be installed, and then everyone else is supposed to, just follow us, right? And God is saying that, he's going to be in charge. All right, so I say these things because this is what the lead up has been, with them, okay, is getting them ready to go to battle. And also, it demonstrates, I think, the irony that all of this effort was put forth for them to depend on God, and yet still they falter when they go and take Jericho. In these first verses here, the Lord says to Joshua, I have given Jericho into your hand, with its king and the valiant warriors. So I'm Joshua, and I'm looking at this city on a hill that's got walls around it that are massive, but God's telling me they're already yours. Okay, they've already been defeated. And I think that is the part that the people had to get in their minds and accept that follow God's way of doing this, and you're going to be victorious. So let's just quickly go through this, because this will set the stage on what's going to happen later. Later, then we'll look at a couple of verses where it actually plays out this way. But we know, how many times are they supposed to march around the city every day for 6 days? Okay, one time, right? One time every day for 6 days, they are to march around. They have a procession, right? So they have the army, in front. They have the priests. They have the ark. They have the priests. They have the horns, and they have the people. One of the things that I found interesting, how do you keep the people quiet? They were not supposed to say anything while they were traversing the city. Now, I think somewhere in here I have what that meant, but I'll just say now, I believe that that the circumference of what they walked was, they think, around a half a mile. Okay, and so they could easily do that. I don't know how many if people was doing this. Okay, around there, walking around there. They were said how many military people had crossed over and everything, but how many people did we say exited Egypt? Or I should say, is now going to enter into Canaan. That would be a better way to put it. Around what? Around 2 million or so people? Okay. All right, so that's a lot of people. Now, I have never seen 2 million people in one place. Has anyone seen that? Football stadiums and things like that, we see how many people are there, and you realize, and then they say, well, there was 40,000 people. It looks like 2 million to me. But these people, traversing the city, were to be kept quiet, kept silent until Joshua told them, speak. Then you got the 7 priests that would follow the army, then the 7 trumpets of the ram's horn. On the 7th day, they marched around 7 times. I'm not going to sing the song. Okay? 7 times, right? And then they were to blow the horns and shout, and when that happened, the walls came tumbling down. Right? That part I do know of the song. Okay. So they went, in verse 7, it says, go forward and march around the city. Okay. It seems the city covered about, and here, this is where you run into trouble when you try to read man's books, because to find information. Some said 6 miles, or it was, 6 acres. One said 8.5 acres. One said 9 acres. One said 11 acres. But it was some number of acres. Okay, and I'm not really good at guessing size like that. When you live in our houses today, you have a postage stamp, that you live on. So, but I believe that they said about 75% of a football field, including the end zone, okay, is an acre. Okay, 75% of that. So take however many, 8 times that, 10 times that. However, it's not gigantic, but it's not small either, right? A small city, and it's interesting too that you see this. Number 7, okay, used. And let me hit this first. So I tried to give you an idea. All right, so this probably doesn't help you at all. This is 8 acres, okay, how big it is. So you kind of know how big a house is and a road. So it's, it's not tiny. And that wasn't really the issue, was it? It was the fact that it had the walls. Okay, and it was built to withstand attacks from the outside. Even the modern army of that day used things like siege ladders. You know what that is? Take a ladder and you put it up against the wall, and you climb up the wall while they're up there shooting and throwing things at you. Okay. Or some of them had machines that would throw things. Okay. Some would try to break into the gate, and we already talked about Jericho had a very weird entrance. There was no gate that you could just go and batter down. Okay, you had to go in, you went down, and then you went up an area that squeezed you in some, so that you were not going to be able to do that very easily. Okay, and come into that. So they think they're sitting up there and they think we got it made. There's no way that you guys can come in and take us. And just imagine, they've been walking around that place for 6 days. Can you imagine what they heard? And the tomatoes, that got thrown at them, and all of that as they walked around. Okay. All right. This number 7 figures prominently in this chapter. In fact, it's used 11 times. Okay? 11 times in this account. 7 priests, 7 trumpets were to march around for 7 days, 7 trips around the city, and then on the 7th day, they were to march around 7 times. And this idea of 7, we've talked about this before. What does that kind of imply? Perfection, right? Complete perfection. Yeah. And so in this case here, in God's plan for them, no matter how foolish it might have seemed, and just the same can be said today, no matter how foolish we might think God's plan for us sounds, we must accept his leadership. And that's what was asked of them. Yes? Mm-hmm. Yeah, this was the first step, right, of taking the land. And so there's a lot of messages for them, for the people that are engaged in this. In 2 Corinthians, the 10th chapter, in verse 3, it says, "We are human, but we don't wage war as humans do. We use God's mighty weapons, okay, not worldly weapons, to knock down the strongholds of human reasoning and to destroy false arguments." Okay. That's what we are asked to do, right, today. And in that kind of similar way, they were asked to do the same thing, only physically, right? Break them down for themselves. Okay, we'll go on into verse 8. So in Hebrews 11:30, it says, "By faith the walls of Jericho fell down after they had been circled 7 days." And is followed then in the next chapter, in first verse, "Therefore let us run with endurance the race that is set before us." Yeah, I don't think this is by accident, okay? then because in the first verse uses the word what? Therefore, to introduce this subject, right? And so because of what had been being said, therefore, or a result or a conclusion is, let us run with endurance the race that is set before us. And so I think that what the Hebrew writer is pointing at is the faith it took, to walk around this place for 6 days, and then the seventh day, walk around 7 days, thinking all along that this is going to, bring victory. They had to have great faith for that, but they had to endure that before they could see the victory, right? And I think this is a very clear message to us, especially given that it's pointed at us here, I think, in Hebrews, that this is what is expected of us. But we tend to want immediate gratification, don't we? We want to ask for it and receive it. We don't want to wait for things. We don't want to give God time, right? The time that it may take. And we see that, don't we? We see that here in Naaman's response when he was told to go dip himself, right, in the Jordan River. And what was his comment? You remember what his... Why is this river better than my river, our rivers that we have back home? And is that not sometimes our logic, I mean, we kind of think like that too, We want to second guess what God says to us. And so I think here, that the Lord was teaching Israel, if you will, the need for patience to find their rest in Him. And they're going to be victorious, but they had to buy that first, right? They had to accept that, internalize that first. And I think there's some other ways of looking at that. We'll look at that in a couple of minutes. So in Joshua chapter 6 and verse 13, we see this thing begin, if you will, to play out, right? So the 7 priests bearing the 7 trumpets that were walking before the ark walked on, and they blew the trumpets continually. Okay, and then the armed men were walking before them, and he kind of goes backward. It kind of says this in a backward sense. And the rear guard was walking after the ark of the Lord while the trumpets blew continually. And so we see originally they were told this is what you're going to do. Now we see this is what they did. Right? I mean, that's basically what these verses say. And so they marched around. They did this for 6 days. Okay, and then verse 15 tells us what happens. On the 7th day, then they rose and they marched around the city in the same manner 7 times. And it was only on that day that they marched around the city that many times. And when the priests had blown the trumpets, then Joshua said what? He told them to shout. Prior to that, he told them they were not to speak, right? They were not to say anything. But now they were to shout, and it says, for the Lord has given you the city. But there's a warning that's given, and it does not, sort of a ominous, there's sort of a couple of ominous verses, if you will, kind of thrown in here. We see why later, don't we? We don't know why now, okay? But they're warned to keep yourselves from the things that have been devoted to destruction. It says, lest you have devoted them, you take any of the devoted things and make the camp of Israel a thing for destruction and bring trouble upon it. So what are some of these devoted things to destruction? Okay, these are things that God has said must be destroyed. The city's burned, right? So the city is one of those things. Food. They find food stuff. I mean, they find even today, archaeologists find jars with burnt corn in them, or inside of it and everything, okay, implying it had been a fire. What about the people? So the people were to be destroyed, were they not? The animals were to be destroyed. The only thing that was really left, if you will, to take out of the city was silver, gold, bronze, and iron. Right? Those were holy. And they were to go into the treasury, right? Treasury of the Lord. And this is where we find later in chapter 7 that we start having trouble, right? That Israel starts having trouble. They don't know why, right? So we'll talk about that then at that chapter. But they didn't really understand why they were having trouble in the first chapter. Excuse me, 7th chapter. Okay, the promise is fulfilled in the last parts of that of the book of the chapter. God's faith. So I wanted to kind of pull out of, if you will, some examples here. So in verse 25, we find out Rahab and her father's household and all who belonged to her were saved. Okay. And I think a way we could look at that is this is God's faithfulness to his word, because that's what was given to her, wasn't it? And so she was saved. God is faithful to his word. And so as she, and this, it says this fairly often, but she has lived in Israel to this day. Of course, not this day, but that day, right? And because she hid the messengers whom Joshua had sent to spy on Jericho. What else do we see here? God demonstrates grace and mercy because of her. Right? We see that God's love, his plan of salvation, we see a hint of that here. Why? I mean, how do we see a hint of what is to come? It's what saves us, right? We see a hint of this here. What is the hint? What nation is Rahab from? Amorite. Okay, she's an Amoritess. Okay, I guess the history of this city is that it used to be the Amorites used to hold the city. Now someone else held it before them, but they held the city. And then Canaan took it back, okay? Canaanites took it back. And so some live there, sort of a mixed group that's living there. She is an Amorite, okay? And how were Jews to interact with Amorites? Were Amorites, did they believe in God? Did they follow God? No, they did not. And so grace is extended to her, and it's grace because she's an Amoritess. And so because God then granted her safety in this case, apart from all the rest of those that were there, right? He gave her grace. And in that way, I think, we see just this peak, right, of what it means later when the gospel is taken to the Gentiles, right? Which is through which we sail. She would have been considered a Gentile, okay, in that way. In that idea. So let's look at some of these verses here. We see this grace and this mercy play out, and we see God's love demonstrated. I don't see it as often as I used to. Maybe they avert the camera, but you used to always see John 3:16, didn't you? At football games and baseball games and all, and they would always find the sign and they would show it on there. I don't see that play out as often. But we see that, God so loved the world that he gave his only son. And I think that this idea of loving the world we begin to see this play out, if you will, with this relationship with Rahab. And then in 2 Peter 3:9, where we receive the greatest, if you will, insight into the Lord, where it says he is patient toward us, not wishing anyone should perish. To me, this is part of the great grace and mercy of our Father and what he is showing to us. And then, of course, we see whoever believes and is baptized will be saved, but whoever does not believe will be condemned. Grace and mercy was extended to Rahab, is extended to us even to today. And then there is another aspect. God demonstrating part of himself to us. It's the surety of his word. Because in the 26th verse, it says, Joshua laid an oath on them at that time, saying, Cursed before the Lord be the man who rises up and rebuilds this city, Jericho. And he points out that at the cost of his firstborn shall he lay its foundation, and at the cost of the youngest son he shall set up its gates. And then we see in the next verse, in 1 Kings 16:34, that in the day of Ahab, and this is something we just recently read, right, in our reading, in our Bible reading. In his days, I put Ahab in there so you know what his is. Hail of Bethel built Jericho. He laid its foundation at the cost of Abiram, his firstborn, and set up its gates at the cost of his youngest son, Segub, according to the word of the Lord which he spoke by Joshua, the son of Nun, which we have just read. Right? Many years later, this is many years later after Jericho had been taken and after the curse had been laid. And we see it play out, see the curse play out because someone rebuilt Jericho. Let's see if I can get this thing to... okay. We see at the beginning of looking at this, Joshua taking over, that there were going to be many obstacles that would come his way. And let me get down to find myself in here. This prophecy that was made is a way to look at God not being able to tell a lie. Right? And when he told them what was going to happen, and now we see that play out, they probably had no idea what it meant. Can you imagine hearing that from Joshua? They probably had no idea what he was talking about. They probably understood the words, but they didn't really understand what was going to happen until later when it did. So we started out, I think, this journey, if you will, with Joshua, talking about what he was how he was going to be able to overcome these obstacles. One was by believing the promises of God, and that's kind of what we heard tonight, wasn't it? He made the promises, told them what they were going to go do. They went into the city, they were victorious, and captured the city, and all of that was the promise of God, and they were I think, proven out to them that they could believe in him. Applying the principles of God's word. In other words, when you can see play out in their attack, if you will, in the city. God wanted idolatry to be eradicated, didn't he? And that was one of the main goals for them to go into Canaan. And so they were told to destroy everything in the city. And we see that they did do that. We see there will be a problem later, but they did do that. They took the lives of those that were there that would later prey on them. Now, they did pretty good, it seems, at Jericho doing that, but each time they go and they have a battle, they do it less and less and less. Okay? We know later that becomes a problem with them. And by counting on the presence of God's person, God said, I'm going to be with you. And he sends the commander of the army, his army, there, and Joshua sees him. Now, can you imagine that for a moment? Okay, you're Joshua, and you see this image, okay, come before you. What would that do to you? It would drive you to believe, right, that what you've been told is going to happen. It was like sending an angel to talk to someone and give them the strength and the willingness to be strong. In Exodus 14:14, we find this said, "The Lord will fight for you while you keep silent." And so I looked a little bit at why were they to be quiet? Okay. I mean, why couldn't they talk? Can you imagine how hard that was to do, to walk around the city every day and not talk, okay, not say anything? And I think that there is a couple of things that we can look at that may give us an insight. One is the Lord will fight for you while you keep silent. That's pretty interesting, isn't it? Why? What's the nature of that? Why would I have to keep silent? Well, to hear what God has to say, and then let him carry out his plan, right? Whatever that is. Because generally, at least many people today, myself might be included in that, after the fourth time, okay, I might have said, hey, what gives? Do you think we're going to have to do this for the rest of the week? Those are the kinds of things that we might say. In Psalms chapter 46 says, "Be still and know that I am God. I will be exalted among the nations. I will be exalted in the earth. The Lord Almighty is with us." We might have a tendency to gripe, complain to others that we're walking around with. Was that second, number 2? Okay, sorry, my hearing's not that great, I guess. Last statement, I will be exalted in the earth. The Lord Almighty is with us, suggesting silence teaches us to need God, to listen to God, and to let his plan work